you were on the Tucker Carlson show as a guest, and we were just remarking
Yes.
that, or I was saying that I think that's pretty uncommon. You don't see a lot of, I don't watch the show, but
Hmm.
I presume you don't see a lot of architects or urbanists on there. That's not the platform you would
Hmm.
think of for that kind of conversation.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
how did that happen? And did you have, frankly, any reservations about being on the show?
Hmm. Well, as it happens, personally, he's very interested in design.
Huh.
That's his, no one knows that because he doesn't get to. As I said, it's irrelevant. But urbanism is very politicized. There is as somebody told me years ago, when we were doing a project near New York City, they were fighting us tooth and nail. And I said, why? This is perfectly logical. My usual arguments. And they said, no, apartments bring Democrats. Apartments bring Democrats. Now, I talk about a, a bumper sticker slogan. But, as it happens, it's absolutely true. It's 100% true. Apartments bring young people who are liberal and love urbanism. And there you go. And as you know, there's a red-blue split between the inner city and the countryside,
Mm.
i.e. suburbia. And by the way, historically, that split is in every country, in every epoch. Okay, from Athens to Austria in the 1920s to Russia in 1917, always, okay, with very few exceptions. For example, Wisconsin with the populist movements in the 20s. But generally, that is a truism. And so that has now been honed by the Reds, the American Reds, into saying that new urbanism wants to take our cars away, which is not entirely untrue, except in the sense that we simply want to give you the choice of walking. The choice of walking. It's an option that's not available
Hmm.
in many suburban places. And you say, well, our right-wing argument is, we're leveling the playing field to let the market decide.
Oh.
Right now, the market is constrained and you can't find a place that you can choose to live where you don't have to own one car per adult, right? So we have all the arguments. What we need to do is to have the accusations asked in front of the audience who believes the accusations. It does absolutely no good to me to speak in front of 1,000 people who are already converted and know the virtues of urbanism, ecological, social, economic. What's the use of that, right? But to actually be in front of 4.5 million people who think you're causing that, who thinks you're trying to take the country over, now that is cool and that's useful. And so, yes, of course, I would accept that. It's exactly who should we be speaking to. It's the people who think that we're against them, and we're actually not. We're just it's just as Chris Alexander once told me, we all know what the appliance is. What we need to do is to design the plugs that connect to the existing power grids. Okay, so he says stop tinkering with the appliance, which is traditional walkable diverse urbanism.
Mm.
Stop tinkering with it. Just show us. Connect. What we need is to design the plugs that connect with the power grids. And by the way, the power grids were plural. And there's a left power grid and there's a right power grid, right? And there are many power grids in this country. And what we have done over time is honed the presentation to each of them. And so as long as I know who I'm speaking to, I can actually make a very empathetic proposal to what their life would be like if they lived in walkable, diverse communities.
That's super well said. That's super well said. And it's something that we've kind of learned from the show, I think, and talking to all these different people, our show, is that one of the big struggles, maybe the greatest struggle, is just communication between what the appliance and what architects or urbanists and urban designers do, and the value of all of that versus, let's say, the general public. And that's a beautiful description to say you're honing and perfecting this appliance, but that's not really the issue. Like the fundamentals have been there for quite some time. It's more about making that connection.
Yeah, absolutely true. Now, the most difficult audience to speak to is the mixed audience, because then, you can actually, well, you basically can't focus. Like, if I know that I'm speaking to academics, that is one presentation. If I know that I'm speaking to, one of the California colleges, in Chico, the University of California, Chico, I know that's a left-wing place. I know how to present. I've done it. And if I know that I'm presenting in New Hampshire, Live Free or Die, which I've also done, I know exactly how to do that as well. It's the mixed audience, which is probably something like what you have, which is the most difficult, because you really can't design the plug properly.
Right.
So you're kind of all over the map.
Yeah.
Is your audience principally architects?
I would say so. Yeah, we have a good mix actually of different designers and people who are interested in designers. But our content is so heavily focused on architecture that.
Right.
With the Tucker Carlson show, so what were some of the things that, in terms of presentation or topics, that you knew you wanted to cover and talk about in a certain way to appeal to the audience that you were speaking to? Like, what are some of the differences?
Well, the first thing that I always ask for in this case, I have spoken to very problematic shows that edit what I say much to my disadvantage. Like you can just, and it's brilliantly done. I mean, they can make me sound like anything, just by clipping. But Carlson, and the reason so many people accept that, it's not his nightly show, it's the big one in which you have 1 hour unedited, and that's rare in media, 1 hour without editing. So when I found out that I wouldn't be edited, I found that he was actually probably in as much danger as I was in terms of seeming a fool. And principally because if I kept the topic to urbanism, I was the master. I mean, I could make him seem a fool very easily. So in some ways, as long as he didn't edit me, he was taking the risk and I wasn't. Okay. Now, I think the interview went fabulously well. We got along super well. He's got a great sense of humor. He actually happens to live in a walkable community with a walkable downtown in a relatively small house. Like, he lives an urbanist life, actually, and hates to drive, the whole thing. So personally, there was a very personal connection with him, because he knew exactly what I was talking about. But what happened was that I didn't know is that he had such a hell of a sense of humor, so that we had a lot of mutual laughs at all the various fools and foolishnesses, not least of which were that we both agreed that the great amount of architecture done today is foolish. And so we had great laughs. What we did is, and I know how to do this, is instead of him being my opponent, I created a third opponent which we could both agree in opposing.
Sure.
And now that was primarily architects. Because we all agree that in general, they've been making the world a much worse place. And let's put it this way. You and I know the 3,000 masterpieces of the 20th century, but that is 1% of the 30 million buildings built, and the win-loss ratio of 20th century architecture is absolutely dismal. I mean, if a lawyer lost that many cases, if a baseball team lost that many games, they would actually be shut down. And yet architects, more often than not, do things, I hate to say that, that are completely disliked by the population as a whole. I'm now in France, and we have a house here, and Nîmes just opened a museum. Nîmes is a Roman town, quite nearby, 20 minutes. It's got it's got great Roman buildings, Maison Carrée and so forth. And there was a new museum done, and I'm a trained architect. I went to good schools. I thought it was a very clever building. It was a museum of, what was it? Of nature, something like that. It was a museum of nature. It had a whole city block right next to the Maison Carrée, and I was rather looking forward to it. And I was visited by someone yesterday who said that the Nîmes has been delisted from the as a World Heritage Site. Delisted. They took it off the list. And, that's a huge honor. And Nîmes is an incredibly deserving place. And here you have one building that single-handedly throws Nîmes into the black hole of oblivion. And you say, well, why the hell did she do that? Why did she do that? Was she so insensitive? Did she really think she was so brilliant that she could kind of overcome the context?
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes with architect. Now, I will probably like that building when I go see it, but I don't confuse myself with a graduate education, with the normal person. Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand modern architecture very, very well, and I really appreciate it, and I really understand it. But I had to go through many years of school to understand it, and it is not populist. Most people don't know what the hell is going on, and that's because it's not coherent. Like, for example, I just keep thinking of this. I once took a group of non-architects to see a Steve Hall building on the campus at Cranbrook, and I love Steve Hall. So we walked up to the Steve Hall building, and they hated it. Everybody hated it. Mm-hmm. And so I was very carefully, I explained what his theory was, what his decisions were. I called attention to intelligent details. I called attention to a lot of things that I know Steve does. And in the end, I convinced, 10 out of 12 that it was a good building, that it was a cool building. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I was able to explain it. It took about an hour of touring. And then we walked down the street to a pool designed by somebody else, one of the other hotshot architects. And they were insulted by it. And they said, what the hell's going on here? What's this about? So just the fact that I had explained one modernist building doesn't mean that they knew anything about modernism. They knew one building, because the other guy shared nothing with Steve Hall, mm-hmm. because that's not the proposition. The proposition is to be unique and not like Steve Hall. So what basically happens is that connoisseurship does not get built up by the modernist architects, which have the prerogative, not only the prerogative, but the expectation that everything is unique and fresh and innovative. Mm. So what they do, as soon as somebody begins to get, I'm talking about a regular person, right? Begins to get some kind of expertise, some kind of connoisseurship, when they're exposed to the next brilliant building, it's like being kicked in the nose, mm-hmm. you see? And that's why people are so ignorant of architecture. It just absolutely it's not a coherent, I would say, endeavor, not to say discourse, let's not even say that, but it's not a coherent endeavor. So it has no followers. Right. It has patrons, who are willing, as I would say, to suffer for the art. They're willing to cover over-budgeted buildings. They're willing to cover buildings that require a great deal of maintenance. They're willing to put up with buildings that don't work very well functionally. Those are patrons, okay? And then there's a class of person that's the client. And the client is somebody that actually meets the architect. You meet the architect, you hire an architect, and there's a lot of contact. And when you have a client, that client can be brought along to a level of expertise. But most architects who do urbanism, like myself, we don't meet the end user. I'm not there in the sales office explaining my ideas. I have customers, and customers have expectations, right? And if you don't meet their expectations, they turn around and buy something else. Mm-hmm. And what happens with the critics is that they look at Steve Hall or Frank Gehry, and they dare compare Frank Gehry, who has patrons, with all that implies, with somebody who merely has clients, or some poor bastard that only has customers. How can you, what's the difference? It's a huge difference. Right. Huge. And the discourse, at least the critical discourse, yes, you can compare my work as an urbanist with other people's work as an urbanist, okay? Because we both have customers, and you can compare Steve Hall to Frank Gehry, but don't compare these people to me.
No,
or like, well, it's a totally different discourse. Now, the paradox that throws everything into a kind of great confusion is that there's a four. There's as I said, there's the patron, there's the client, and there's the customer. Mm-hmm. But then there's something else, which is the victim. And the victim is a person that has such a difficult time scoring housing of any kind that they're grateful. Okay, when housing is affordable, you can pull any experiment you want on anybody you want. And as long as they have a roof over the head and a bathroom, they're grateful. And that's why you get so much good architecture, avant-garde architecture, which is actually for the victims. For the people who are the unfortunates, because they'll say, thank you, God, I haven't got a choice. And there's all this confusion. And if somebody would just settle down and say, look, the critics are really discussing 4 levels of practice. And if you don't, you can't confuse them. Like somebody who designs for the middle class, who is not, the American middle class are not innocent of they're not virtuous, they're not in a state of nature, in which things become evident to them. They are highly manipulated. Before your urban project is visited by them, they have visited 6 other places, and the realtors have manipulated the hell out of them.
Yeah,
they're not innocent. So it's a totally different thing, totally. And you get all these critics. And by the way, I want to say one more thing. Why on earth should an architect pay any attention to a critic that doesn't even practice? Like, they only have power because we grant them power by listening to them.
Right.
I certainly won't. Like, I'm not going to empower anybody that doesn't know what I'm doing, that doesn't even practice, But if somebody else practices, and I know many architects who practice, and when they criticize what we do, damn, that is useful and valuable. Thank you. That's really good. But just to go back to kindergarten, every time somebody spouts something stupid about urbanism, I'm not running a kindergarten. I'm not going to teach elementals anymore. I used to, and it's exhausting. I salute kindergarten teachers, but I can't do it.
There's something with the repetitiveness. If you have to speak the same, let's say, truths over and over and over to people who keep bringing up what would appear to be silly remarks. There's so many things to unpack there. One of the first thoughts.
Well, may I just say one thing that happens if you're having a public meeting, and it could be like this interview. If we maintain this at the level of kindergarten, if you were to ask me questions, what do you mean by walkability and stuff like that, right? Those people who know nothing would be very pleased and would like the show, but every single advanced person would leave. Yeah. You can't have both in the same room. Yeah. You can't be answering kindergarten questions and have really sophisticated people in the same room. At the same time, you can't have a continual set of sophisticated discussions and keep the kindergartners in the room. And that's what happens in the public process. Too many of the planners who are running a public participation process actually take all the questions equally, regardless of how repetitive and unsophisticated they are. And so they say, well, no one came to the meeting. And I said, yeah, because the kindergartners were too stupid to come. And really smart people, you chase them out of the room. Yeah. So they dropped out. So I always run, in my discussions, I always run a triage. Okay, if I don't lose 2/3 of the audience before I'm done, I haven't actually said anything of value.
If you don't
at the end of this show, you have to lose 2/3 of the audience. And that's the best test you have, that you've actually said something. that's of tremendous value in innovation, because people say, no, this is not what I believe already. This is, no, he's so full of shit. Yeah, it's not what I read when I, all this stuff. And so what happens is that I fully intend to help you lose 2/3 of your audience.
I was going to say, that's a fantastic view, because I feel much better about our show automatically. But God, there's so many things to pick up. It's interesting your remark about the kindergartners versus the more sophisticated conversations, and this is on a different scale and a different space. But I often feel personally we face the same issues on social media, frankly, because social media more and more wants quick sound bites, and quick sound bites more and more have to be at the kindergarten level of like, let's all be happy, guys. That's the key to success. Be optimistic.
Oh my God, yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know, why is anyone liking this content? It's not interesting.
Oh my God, Facebook, with all my friends in Facebook, it's idiotic. Everybody, it's like a mutual admiration society.
Yeah.
It's Jesus, it's like the Harvard Club. Like everybody loves everybody else. It's a mutual admiration society.
Yeah,
and it's disgusting. And I know that people individually are super smart, super sharp, and actually quite cynical. But they're only nice to each other in this closed group of Facebook. Yeah. Oh my God, it's horrible.
The other thing that came up when you were earlier on in the bit that you were talking about. You were discussing modernism or modern architecture and its challenges, and you were tying that to how it's received by the majority of people, right? The popularity of it, in a sense. And I was wondering, so at what point though does the popularity of something become overvalued? Like, why should we care if the 85% of the people, or the 2/3, like it or don't like it, when those who are educated know, well, you don't like it because you just don't know better, but let me still produce what I think is right because I've studied it?
Well, it's a great question. Let me give an answer that is at the most abstract. Okay. I was once complaining about the word hoi polloi. That's not a denigrated word. You should look it up. It's actually an old Greek word for normal people, the hoi polloi. Okay. And they had a real problem in Athens with the democracy. When they ran a really pure democracy, the outcome was not intelligent. And they called it the hoi polloi. But anyway, so I was once complaining to my brother Douglas, who's in the same field I am, about the hoi polloi. I said, look, Douglas, every Monday morning, last week I rolled the boulder uphill against all sorts of resistance, right? And resistance, by the way, being mediocrity. Okay, you have to understand, mediocrity is a force as strong as gravity. Mm-hmm. Okay, and in fact, it's a lot like gravity. When you launch anything, okay, no matter how high the trajectory, somehow, okay, just like gravity brings that stone down, okay, your idea actually it's brought down by mediocrity. Okay. So I was saying, Douglas, this is happening to me. The stone is always at the bottom of the hill Monday morning, and I have to roll it uphill. And I was bemoaning my fate. And he says, Andrés, you don't understand the myth of Sisyphus. Okay. Do you know what he was being punished for? Do you know what he was being punished for? I said, no, I just knew it was a punishment. He said he was being punished for insulting the gods. All he had to do was stop insulting the gods, and his punishment would be over, and everything would roll downhill. So what happens when you have somebody, there's a personality trait of we, the new urbanists, that actually we're continually insulting the gods. Okay, we're insulting the gods of the people who walk in that you were mentioning, your original question. Mm-hmm. What happens when it gets to be just too stupid and low level? But you insult the gods who are the traffic engineers. You insult the gods who are the politicians, who are venal. You insult the gods who are the developers, who know what sells. You insult the gods who are the fire marshals, okay? And every time you explain something to them, Even if you are totally rational and you have evidence, you're insulting the gods. Therefore, it's difficult. Therefore, you are Sisyphus. You're a Sisyphus kind of person that actually has to move the, but he says, Douglas told me, Andres, you have all the skills. If you don't want to roll the boulder uphill, stop being an urbanist and stop insulting the gods, and everything will go smoothly. So that's the most abstract answer I can give you. That is why we do it. But there's another thing, okay? We have entered an absolutely populist century. Populist, okay? Yes, there's an elite, the avant-garde, etc. It is tiny. It is infinitesimally small, okay? I have virtually no contact with it. It's in very few elite cities, very few elite classes, etc. It has nothing to do with reality, okay? And it's a game they play, and I probably don't even know how to play it. I mean, I was educated enough to know how to play it. I can no longer play the game of the elite, of the connoisseurship, of the avant-garde, okay? But the really amazing thing about our century is that it is populist in terms of architecture. Now, what do I mean by that? This is the first century where the uneducated have had enough money to affect the built environment, okay? Before this time, the only people who had enough money were to affect buildings and campuses and town plans were highly educated, okay? And the poor, they got to actually decide what bonnet to buy, okay? What bonnet or what, folk costume. Okay, let us say they affected their clothing, they affected their dance a little bit, they affected their festivals, but they by no means had enough slack, economic wherewithal to affect the built environment in a large way. Now, for the first time, completely uneducated people that have never heard of Vincent Scully, that have no clue of the history of architecture, have enough money to buy houses in quantity, 1.8 million a year, okay? That is the challenge of the 21st century and the 20th, late 20th. And why would you not want to do the most interesting challenge? Like, why do you want to play the game that's as old as the Renaissance? Like, what the hell? That's so tiring, so tiresome. What's new is wrestling with populism. That's what's new. In some ways, that's what you guys are doing, because you have a discussion group that's obviously populist. It is intrinsically, and it's right in front of you. It's the people who make decisions. It's the people who elect idiotic elected officials. They're the people. Who have it's the people who choose the McMansions. You know what I mean? It's not Cartier who's deciding anything. So why would you not want to do that? Do you want to live in another century? I think that we the populists are the only people who are living the modern life. And everybody else has a nostalgia for the past. I have a nostalgia for the future, in which that energy of populism, the energy of the vernacular, the incredible creativity that's potentially there, which is manifest in language. Like, it first comes up in language. My God, the words they come up with, the regular people back at the slum, at the neighborhood, the vocabulary, and then it gets brought up, by Tom Wolfe, and then eventually enters the Oxford English Dictionary. There's a climb from the bottom to the top. There's nothing happening from the top to the bottom. They don't hear any of that stuff. But back in academia, everybody's studying from the bottom up. And we're right there with the bottom. We're right there looking at the sneakers that they're buying and designing. And that's where the action is, all of it. We're the only modernists. And by the way, one more thing about modernism. The only thing that distinguishes modernism is not abstraction. It's not abstraction, because African art is abstract, because the cave paintings are abstract, okay? There's been abstraction, the Inca patterns are abstract. It's not abstraction, they're wrong. What's new? It's large numbers. The only thing about modernity that is new is the large numbers.
What do you mean by that?
The numbers of people who are being born, the number of people who have to be educated,
Oh.
the amount of money, how quickly things get done, how many people take flights every day. You know, you talk about, oh, yesterday 3,000 flights were canceled. Okay, talk to me about that. Okay, it's all large numbers. All the important stuff is large numbers. Okay, a little piece of art somewhere, you know, is only important when it sells for $1.49 million. You know, you're like this new young lady who used to sell paintings for 450 and now she sells them for 14 million. That's a large number, so she's important.
Right.
Okay, but if it's not large numbers, it's simply not modern.
Mm.
And so I am completely fascinated by the large numbers. Like, we work at breakneck speed. You know, like Rem Koolhaas once said, and a Chinese architect is 200 times more efficient than an American architect. You know, I mean, he knows what the hell he's talking about. Rem is amazing. So I want to be only 1/50th as efficient. I would like to reduce my inefficiency to 1/50th. I would like to be 1/50th as efficient as a Chinese architect.
We expand on that. Wait, what does that mean exactly?
Well, everybody else is 1/200th as efficient. I would like to climb to 1/50th.
Okay.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
You know, but it's all, I mean, this is a joke, but it's not a joke. It's not a joke. They produce work at 200 times the rate that we do. The working drawings just fly out the door.
Right.
And so it's all large numbers. And I want to summarize, large numbers is speed. We admire speed. We admire quantity. How many iPhones did you sell? Wow. How many people are there on your tweet? Wow. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, how many houses did you sell last year? Wow. How fast does your car go? Wow. You know, how fast, how much, large numbers. All the architects, the Frank Gehry's of the world, had known nothing of large numbers. They're completely uninterested in large numbers. Everything is unique. It's crafted, you know, but you say, but it's so abstract. Isn't that modernity? No, it's not modernity. Take a look at a cave painting. Abstraction is ancient, okay? Large numbers is modernity. And that's why we're interested in what we do. And that's why I'm interested in populism. And yes, we want to saddle it. We don't want to be their servants, but we certainly want to engage it. That's who we want to engage, is the middle class, the vast middle class of the world.
It's interesting. I mean, I think on the one hand, when you think about large numbers and efficiency and speed and the things that you're describing, that would seem almost in opposition to ingenuity, and it would seem like that is just like, where's the qualitative aspect of that conversation? What, you know, it becomes purely quantitative, and that's a very dangerous thing. Even in the residential space, like, how much does this house sell for? How many square feet is this house? And it's like, well, there's much more to a house than just a square footage.
Right. Well, that's the metrics that they are being taught. Like, for example, when somebody in the old days, when they came to Seaside, okay, when Seaside was what it was and it wasn't famous, they had already been to, you know, they were going to buy a house in Florida. So they had stopped in 6 developments between North Carolina and Florida, okay? And all the brochures were lying in the back of their back seat. And they had talked to a lot of realtors, and they had been trained by these realtors to expect price per square foot, to expect bathrooms of a certain size, big closets, you know, extra places to dine, you know, the breakfast room, the family Thanksgiving room, you know, all this. Okay. So they were trained. And then they would show up at Seaside and look at these little wooden houses that cost more. Okay, that cost more. And they would come in and they were flabbergasted. And they would say, why are you selling less for more money?
Right.
Why are you selling less square footage for more money? And we said, okay, well, and they would be looking up at the ceiling, because they kind of learns subliminally that you can see the size of the room by the ceiling, because the floor is all crumbed up with furniture. You really can't tell. So look at the ceiling and wonder, like, could I possibly live in a living room this size? You know, really? And so I would say, well, let's sit down in the porch. And we would sit down in the porch in a swinging bench, and they'd swing a little bit, and then we'd talk a little bit, and then they would begin looking around and say, you know, Martha. And I said, isn't this kind of nice? Like, sitting in this porch, like, what do you think about it? Says, yeah, and slowly we'd bring them around to that value that you mentioned, that are values other than quantity. Okay, so obviously we had enough people doing that we might lose 1 in 6. We might lose 5 out of 6, but we caught that one. And then what happened was, but nobody paid attention. Nobody paid attention until it started selling for much more than the comparables. Once that started, the whole Urban Land Institute and everybody else who was the developer started paying attention. Wow, how do you do this? And they started coming to visit Robert Davis, the developer, to ask questions, to learn from Robert Davis, who very young became a guru. And actually, he started the Seaside Institute to do educational courses that ultimately got decanted to the new urbanism for people who wanted to learn how this was done. And I said, well, how come you're paying so much? I said, it isn't just the porch. Look at the street. Isn't the street great? Well, that's your living room. You can live in the street. They said, oh, man, that's great. And then they said, well, why don't we have a media room? I said, well, you don't have a media room because you can go to the cinema, which is within walking distance. And they said, well, why don't we have a lawyer, a double height space like everybody else? They said, well, because you have a plaza. Why do we only have one dining room? Because you got a cafe down the street, you see. Why don't I have a gym in the master bedroom? Because there's a gym down the street. So what happened was the developer was actually providing everything. It was just not in the house. And so the house could be dwindled in size without any downsizing of the quality of life, because the quality of life was within walking distance. And that was actually the secret formula. As they say, the secret sauce of Seaside was that you externalize the amenities, while in the McMansion, it's defined by internalizing the amenities. Like you might go to Houston and say, God, this is miserable. I'm driving in misery. I hate this stuff. But once you enter the McMansion, it's awesome. It's awesome. The interior is awesome. It's fantastic. It's fantastically comfortable. It's a bargain. Everything that's in there is great. It's just the outside, the public realm. What we did is we reversed that. And we made a fantastic public realm that allowed us to take the pressure off the house. And so the houses could be smaller and smaller lots and denser. You see, and that's really the formula. But it didn't work as a theory. It only worked when it started selling for more per square foot. And then the developers all piled up.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more how you got to the opportunity in designing Seaside, Florida, which is a new town, right? Like how did that come up?
What's the story behind that? Because I remember studying it in school, and it's a remarkable... I think anyone who's interested in urbanism, would dream of being able to author a neighborhood.
Well, it's really easy. Okay. Let me tell you one thing about the suburbs. Okay. The suburbs are balanced, okay, because the market studies are very, very accurate. And what you find in the suburbs are townhouses and small houses and large houses and a lot of stores in the form of shopping centers and a lot of workplaces in the work of office parks. Okay. And you have all the schools. Schools are there too. And so is the infrastructure. Everything that is needed for a mixed use town is available in the suburbs. It's just segregated into single use pods. It's not assembled into a town. What we did, what we've always done and what we still do, is we take what is going to be built out there, right? The townhouse clusters, the McMansion pods, the shopping centers, the shopping malls, the office parks, the elementary schools, and assemble them into a town. Anybody that knows how to do it, it's not a matter of activating the program. The program is out there being built at a tremendous rate every year all over the country. It's just never assembled. And the reason it's never assembled, there are several reasons, is that A, it's against the code to assemble it because the codes segregate all the uses. So it takes a very special person to want to push that boulder uphill to convince the fire marshal, to convince the zoning codes, et cetera. So basically it takes a personality type that's rare. And it's rare because the suburban stuff sells anyway. It's not like you're saying, I'm really screwed. I can't sell it unless it's a new urbanist mixed-use community. No, the other stuff sells. So it's not, that's what I mean. You don't have to throw the boulder up the hill, push it up the hill, because actually the stuff in the flat sells. And actually in many markets, it's actually downhill. You can pre-sell this stuff. So to answer your question, it's actually more conservative than you think, because the stuff is being built anyway. We just went through the trouble of assembling it, of knowing how to assemble it into what is a traditional town. Now, there are a lot of people who don't want the competition, so they say bad things about it. They say, well, it doesn't sell. Well, that's a lie. They say, well, the streets don't work. Well, that's a lie. So one of the things we've created is a lot of antibodies. There's a lot of myth around new urbanism that says it doesn't work, nobody wants it. And that's why it's so important to me personally that our stuff outsells the competition sometimes by multiples. Now you say, well, isn't that gross? Well, I'm sorry, that's how our society keeps score.
Yeah.
If you want this idea to spread, you've got to say, like, why should architecture be different from stocks? I love that stock. I love Apple. It goes nothing but up. Well, what about Seaside? Why does Seaside get blamed for doing nothing but up? Why do we get blamed for appreciation when everybody else is actually lauded and admired for appreciation? What's up with that?
Probably because your critics there tend to be on the left side, and anything remotely close to making a bunch of money for a lot of folks in architecture is kind of dirty or evil. And this is not a controversial thing I'm saying, I don't think. I mean, we've spoken to a lot of architects, especially once you have their own business, and they're like, I don't know why this mentality exists all the way down to the level of the, undergraduate schools.
Well, I think we can actually be pretty cruel about it and explain. There is a phenomena that I began studying architecture in 1968. And it was still good old pragmatic Americans, okay, who taught how to make nice places and who actually taught us how to observe things that were pleasant. They were modernists, but they still taught us to say, this is a really pleasant house. This is a pleasant town, etc. Okay. And in my own education as the usual 7-year education, the Europeans started coming in. Okay. It switched. Gropius was the beachhead, but then every school wanted to have Europeans. And by the time I was a senior, there were quite a few Brits teaching. And the Brits were okay. They were just Newtown people, from the British Newtown movement. And then we started getting the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, which was Peter Eisenman. And he began bringing real left-wing socialist architects, okay, with these fantastically attractive, convoluted theories, And what happened is they took over. Okay, they absolutely control the discourse in the academy to the extent that you don't get tenure unless you actually use their methodology. And my wife is Elizabeth is first of all, I've taught in all the schools. Okay, it's not like I'm innocent of that. I've seen it, but Liz was dean at the University of Miami for 18 years, and it was a rear guard action. It was a holding action to keep it away, while at least some professors still taught how to make places that were pleasant and made sense for people. But it's overwhelmed now. You can't keep it away because the whole method of getting tenure is how many footnotes you can actually elicit from the accepted obscurantists of Europe. And now, I'm not saying that I have lots of professors who are friends. They're really nice people. They just don't know how to do anything else. They're not evil. They're not trying to screw people up. It's their discourse. They don't know how to do anything but that. By now, they're 3 generations from knowing, even being able to talk about something. By the way, I'm not even talking about beauty. Okay, I'm talking about beautiful. That is mildly controversial and classist and all that. Okay. And maybe beauty should be canceled, okay? No, because it's the dominant culture and all that. I get it. But pleasant, like, can somebody please talk about a pleasant room with a pleasant light and a pleasant way to have a conversation and a pleasant way to watch a damn TV set? Like, could we have a pleasant experience in front of a screen? Does anybody even teach that? Could we have a pleasant experience storing shit so it's not all over the place? You know, could we have a pleasant experience in the bathroom?
Yeah.
Why does it have to be existence minimum, as if we were starving to death? You know, as if we were socialists why do we have to, you know, and anyway, who are we doing this for? Who are we garnering? Who are we trying to get the approval of? Well, critics who are academics, essentially, in their outlook. And if you want to get famous, it's up and down. It's got the complete control of the discourse. And those of us who are outside of it have a completely separate discourse. And I spend a lot of time telling my folk not to have an inferiority complex. You know, like, no, we're cool. We're talking about real things, and we're just as smart, and we're even more skillful than they are. Yeah. You know, and we're braver because we do things that can be compared. No one is more of, you know, any classicist, and I'm not a classicist, but any classicist who does a classical building is a very brave person because he can be compared to Palladio. He can be compared to Michelangelo. Okay, do you think Eisenman is brave because of his buildings? No, he can only be compared to Eisenman. Eisenman is always the champion of Eisenman world because there's no other. He writes the rules. Gehry is always the champion of Gehry world. Okay, but when you actually enter a discourse that has a common language, particularly a common language that is centuries old, really, do you want to be compared to Lutyens? You are a brave boy to be compared to Lutyens because, you know, and you can be compared to Lutyens. And even when you do modern architecture, which is referential, you know, like let's say with Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, it's as opposed to just inventing shit that no one else does. My God, you are going to be compared to Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, that is audacious in the extreme to do that. You know, you're taking a Ferrari, which is, let's say, the Prairie School, you're taking a Ferrari and not just polishing it because it's beautiful. You're taking it to the edge of the precipice. You are in danger, boy. You know? Okay. Are you really going to do that with the Prairie School? Because you're going to go off the precipice. And I find my colleagues are genuinely brave. They enter the ring to box with Palladio and Lutyens. Come on.
That's interesting.
It's madness.
It's madness. It's a very, very interesting way to view it, and it makes sense. It's also fascinating that you'd have to spend time convincing people in your group, like, you know, feel more assured about what you're doing. And I guess maybe some of the envy comes from, you know, the things that are new, that are different, that are flashy, that get the press.
Well, what they do is you're outside, you're off the edge. What they do is they keep you outside the discourse. It's like you don't exist. I don't know. One of the things that you find, for example, when you're my age, as soon as I got white hair, I have incredible energy, and I'm very young, actually. Most people underestimate. But once I had white hair and I enter a group of young people, I don't exist.
Really?
It's not a feeling you've ever had, but it's a peculiar feeling. It's like they might be talking right across you. Okay. There might be a guy on my left and a guy on my right. And you can sit down at a table with young people at Starbucks. Okay. 5 young men, let alone 5 young women. You do not exist. It's a very interesting meeting. So what happens is that all my incredibly skillful traditionalist friends, they don't exist. Nobody publishes them. Nobody pays attention to them. They write books. They have incredibly intelligent things to say. They're well-intentioned, and they're smart, and they're brave, and they don't exist. So yeah, it makes you a little insecure. And so I try to, because I bridge the worlds, you know, I bridge the worlds because I'm always knocking on the doors of the high end. I mean, I've got 4 honorary degrees, 4 honorary doctorates from good universities, you know, like I can bridge. Okay. And as a bridger, I assure them that they are absolutely the bee's knees, that they are really the brave ones, And I try to give them a great deal of confidence. And they give me confidence too, because they say, thank you for being such an ass. Because I'm also very critical. We were really grateful that you told us this. Like I'm always telling you, I said, you guys are just polishing the Ferrari of classicism. Take it to the edge of the precipice. Because like for example, my favorite architect is actually Plečnik. Joseph Plečnik, who is a classicist. He died about 1955, and he took classicism to the edge of the precipice. And it is incredible. If you've ever been to Slovenia, where he did an enormous number of buildings in Ljubljana, but also in the the house of the president, called Prague Castle in Czechoslovakia. Just look up Josef Plečnik. It's unbelievable what he did for classicism. Unbelievable. And with him are many, many architects that are ignored by the historians. They're absolutely ignored. By the way, I'm writing a book on them. Here it is.
It'll be the first book on your bookshelves.
Look at this.
Oh my
It's
goodness.
a 3-volume set.
Oh, goodness.
It's a 3-volume set called Heterodoxia. Okay. And it's absolutely devastating and irrefutable.
Okay. That's a fantastic description of the book. I want to kind of take a moment and maybe define some of the basic terms at the kindergarten level for folks who are uninitiated.
Yeah.
So can you give us a quick description of what new urbanism is? Is it an urban design approach? Is it a suburban design approach? Like, what is new urbanism?
Well, new urbanism, as a lot of people like to say, is the old urbanism. Okay. Like, for example, our presumably well-intentioned critics say, why is everybody so excited? It's the old urbanism. And actually, it's not the old urbanism at all. What it is, it's an American pragmatic movement based at the scale of urbanism about whatever works best in the long run. And so our new urbanist communities are hybrids. All of them are hybrids. And for example, they have streets that are the old way because they're less expensive and they're more pleasant, they're more walkable. They have an urban pattern which is much more mixed use. So you can get to the 50% of America that doesn't drive. And that includes children, the people who don't have enough money to own a car, and the old people who don't drive. They have access to everything. Right now, 50% of America it's inaccessible. You talk about an accessibility need. You can't even get to the McDonald's to get on the ramp,
Right.
to get the hamburger. And we're all worried about the ramp.
Right.
Does it have a ramp? Well, you can't get there in the first place because it's inaccessible. And 50%, exactly 50% don't drive. Okay. You also force people who do drive, you force a lot of people to own a car, which costs $10,000 a year minimum, which actually covers $100,000 worth of mortgage. So one of the things we do is give the choice of living in such a way that you don't need a car, which is perfectly possible. That's the old way. Okay. Mixed use, walkability, diversity. Okay. And any town that is functional has a whole range of people living within walking distance, including people who wash dishes and people who are great chefs and people who can pay for the great meals. Okay. You cannot pay for a great meal. You can't be a rich person and get the satisfactions of being a rich person if somebody doesn't do the dishes. Okay. So you got to have the mixed use, diversity. But we also do it so that there's parking. Like if you want a car, we provide the parking. You don't need to have a car, but if you do, there's parking. And by the way, it's not like a medieval town where there's no parking, or New York City where there's no parking. Okay, so we provide the parking. But above all, what we do is we graft on suburban developer management techniques. Because if we were to go back to a traditional main street in America at its heyday in 1950, and you said, I want to buy a pair of trousers, I want to buy trousers here, or I want to eat here. If we took you back to 1950, you couldn't stand it. There's not enough choice. There are not enough sizes. People are too rude. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, the menu has 3 items. Like, what the hell's going on here? It's disgusting. America in the heyday what has happened is that suburban developers are rather mediocre in their physical products, but they're masters of management, masters. And the way they manage through homeowners associations, which are private governments, the way they manage that, the way they manage retail, the way they manage getting a loan, the way they manage picking up the garbage, the way they manage trimming trees and landscape, the way they manage programming for children is brilliant. So what we do is we hybrid the essentially, we hybrid the management techniques of the suburban developers with the hardware, and I call that the software, with the hardware of the traditional town. And so that it's the best of both worlds. Like a new urbanist community is the best place there's ever been to live because you have the best of both worlds. Like, for example, most traditional towns are the building types are dark. I mean, for example, I'm here in a delightful, I have a house in a French medieval town. Most of the houses that make these beautiful idiosyncratic streets, most of the houses, when you go inside, they're unbearable. Unbearable. They're dark. The bathroom's incredibly uncomfortable. The layout is horrible. The stairs don't work. Like, they're unbearable and yet the public space is great. When you visit Paris and everything, the number of people, you love Paris, you love this town of Uzès where I am, but the number of people, the 10,000 apartments that you wouldn't dream of living in are right here. So what do? We actually hybrid the wonderful street space of traditional towns with a lot of the light and air and privacy and nice functional layouts of American modern suburban development. So you were to ask me, and I'm going to give you an example. Okay, let us talk about Uzès right here. Uzès, which is where Leo Creer, I'm here in house Leon Creer designed for himself to retire, which we were lucky enough to be able to purchase from him when he moved to Spain. Okay, so Leo Creer chooses this city to live in, and Leo Creer knows what he's talking about, and he has a choice. He speaks 5 languages. He could have lived anywhere, but he chose this place. And so the public space is absolutely delightful. It's to die for, all of it. But the private space is dark, dingy, and cold. Okay, so then you go to Dallas. Let's go to North Dallas. If you and I were to go, you would say, what a horror to commute here. What sheer boredom. What a terror. What an ecological nightmare to actually be polluting like this. What a horrible life being a soccer mom. So the public realm is terrible. But if you have ever walked into a modern McMansion, which you probably haven't, it's amazing. The private realm is great. Okay, so what we combine is both. We care equally for the public realm and the private realm. Now, the question you should ask next is any city in the world that combines them that is your model? Is there any city that has that balance? And I would say, in my mind, clearly yes. And it's Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston miraculously has a fabulous public realm by virtue of the age in which it was built. It was one of the old English cities, but it also has a typology that by sheer luck of responding to the tropics, the Charleston side yard house, you get wonderful houses of light and air and pure delight and privacy. Charleston is the most perfectly balanced place of public and private that I've ever seen. And there it is. And so the new urbanists, we actually learn from Charleston. We actually learn from the McMansion. We learn from the medieval cities, which is what Leo Creer has taught us. But here's something that's going to shock you. We also learn from the Mormons. And you say, what? What are you learning from the Mormons? The Mormons, between circa 1855 and 1995, laid out 534 towns and cities in the West without any money, most of which survive to this day, and they're not ghost towns. The Mormons are the Henry Ford of urbanism. Okay?
Really?
Like Brigham Young is the Henry Ford of urbanism. I mean, no one has built 530 towns like he did. And there's a protocol, there's a methodology. And we, in the pursuit of large numbers, which I spoke about earlier, I'm fascinated by large numbers. As soon as I heard that Brigham Young had laid out 530, by the way, they were rather interested. All their interesting literature is town planning. Forget the theology. I mean, that's weird stuff. But the town planning is fabulous. Now, they were not professionals. So you have to interpret what they did and try to understand why they did it. What were they doing? Why was the Mormon block so large? Why were the streets so wide, et cetera, et cetera? So all I needed to know is that he had laid out 530 plus towns and cities. And I said, I'm studying that. And my office and a fellow called Matt Lambert, who's my partner now, went into a deep dive of Mormon town planning, to the extent that I actually I've lectured on Mormon town planning to the Mormon bishops in Salt Lake City, reminding them about what their incredible legacy. And so it's all protocol. The interesting thing about the Mormons is the protocol by which they assembled. And everybody says, well, they're all white, like, oh, something's wrong with the Mormons, they're all white. Well, they may have been all white, but they were incredibly diverse, okay? Incredibly diverse. Brigham Young made sure that whenever a Mormon settlement was laid out, first of all, he did hydrological studies to make sure there was water. Then he did soil studies to make sure there was fertile ground. And then he actually laid out the Mormon block, which everybody says it's a standard dimension. It's not a standard dimension. It actually was adjusted to the fertility of the ground because he wanted people to be self-sufficient in their farms. And then he had a sequence of what you had to build by the first spring, by the third spring, and by the 10th spring. So you actually build a mud hut, then a wooden building, then a brick compound, okay? And he also assembled he had the ability to do what's called a call. He assembled a call, and he would make sure that there were enough men, women, literate people who would be school teachers, old women, young women, and men, farmers, people who knew how to make a barrel, would make a keg for exportation, people who knew how to fire a gun for defense. So he would assemble the society to be utterly diverse. And that was the source of the success. So I look at this stuff and I say, okay, I know it's not 1895, but damn, that was clear thinking. And so what we do is we design the plug. That's a very, very effective appliance. The Mormon town, called the Mormon state. It's a very effective appliance, which everybody ignores in academia because it's Mormons, and they're whatever, like there's a million things wrong with them, including their underwear. Right. Oh, come on, like, please, and they wouldn't even look at it. But I see this fantastic, absolutely fantastic protocol, which is to say the appliance, according to Chris Alexander, and then I design a plug. I modernize it and I put it into systems. And right now I'm about to start another book about what to do, what the genuine response is to climate change in terms of adaptation. How are we going to respond when 10 years from now, we all realize that we have not gone to 50% of carbon zero by 2030. So we're screwed, completely screwed. According to the science, we're screwed. If we don't go to 50% by 2030, we're screwed. Well, just read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. We're shooting up in the wrong direction. We're not going to make it. Okay, so what's going to happen is there's going to be a great pall, a great depression. And people are going to say, well, what do we do next when we haven't got the hope of mitigating climate change? I say adapt. You can adapt to what's going to happen. And if you do this kind of thing that we're now working on, you can have a pretty damn good time for 2 or 3 generations. Now, of course, the green maniacs, they want to save everybody and every species forever. Can you imagine the megalomania of people say, well, we got to save the people in Sri Lanka and we have to save the butterfly and it's got to be forever. It's got to be for the year 3000. You have got to be kidding. That's monomaniac. All we're saying is that maybe for a generation or 2 and perhaps 3, you can have a really decent life locally if you follow these protocols, which is really the next agenda of the new urbanism. What do we do when mitigation fails? What are the protocols for adaptation? And actually, it is politically incorrect to talk about adaptation. I've made a lot of enemies because adaptation, because it means that you have lost hope on mitigation.
Well, right.
And they don't want to make that public. They don't want to know. They know privately that it's true. And the young people know it's true. And everybody knows it's true, but you can't say it.
Yeah.
And so we're keeping it down until there's a call. And they're going to say, well, what do we do now when we've actually hit all the irreversible turning points? What do we do now? And we're going to be there. And we're going to
so in 8 to 10 years, we'll call you up and say, hey, it's your time. This is the time.
Yeah. And I'm not and people say, you're causing all sorts of problem. You're going to cause. I am not going to cause mitigation to fail.
Yeah. No.
Like, are you really that insecure that some guy is going to write something and people are going to stop trying to mitigate? They're so insecure. And yet the evidence just comes in. I mean, it's either the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal today. Yeah. It's just all going in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Okay, now, it may not be accelerating in quite the rate, but it's still accelerating.
Yeah.
And besides, we're now finding that everybody's lying to us. The Germans lied. Okay, it was all greenwash about shutting down the power plants because they were buying the stuff from Russia. They were just offshoring the carbon they purchase. Okay, I'm sorry. The Norwegians, the little saints of environmentalism, how do they subsidize all the great stuff they do? By selling North Sea oil to somebody else. Doesn't anybody see that? And when China says we canceled 200 coal-fired power plants,
right?
Aren't we great? Well, out of how many did you cancel?
Sure.
Well, out of 700. You just made up that number. You made up 700 so you could cancel 200, right? And look good. And they're idiots who actually don't see this. They don't see the manipulation. I learned something the other day which was amazing. Okay, which is what's the green company that used to be Shell? The green gasoline company. They've got a little star, a little green thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're big. Yeah. It's anyway. So they advertise that they're going to go to that by 20, whatever, I don't know, it's 20 or 2030, 2050, they're going to be zero carbon. The oil company is going to be zero carbon. Do you know what they're talking about? Zero carbon in their process, in their production. The stuff they sell is not counted. Okay, yeah. I just learned that yesterday. They're cheating like crazy. And if you read the small print, it's our operation is going to be zero carbon by 2050. But what are you selling at zero carbon? Oh, we're selling oil.
Right.
I mean, when are we going to talk about this?
It's
and
kind
by
of...
the way, why am I in trouble for talking about it? I'm just thinking ahead 8 years.
It's not very far away. I don't know. It's a lot to take in. I think it's partially. I think what's worse, you were saying people don't know this. How can they not know this? I think it's worse when people know it, but they just choose to be willfully ignorant or choose to.
But what about somebody who tries to talk about it and gets shut down?
Well, that's
like
just a bummer.
It's even worse.
No, it is worse.
Like, you're a denialist. You said, well, you're a denialist. I said, no, you're a denialist. Yeah. I'm actually following what the science says. Yeah. I'm looking at the graphs.
Yeah.
You think there's hope. Where? Based on what? There's no evidence. Zero evidence that anything's getting better. Everything's getting worse.
Do you ever...
Who's the...
I was going to ask, do you ever, in this portion of the conversation or just things in general, find it difficult to stay optimistic and stay motivated to do the work, to convince people to go speak, to et cetera, because of all the things you just said?
No, because you have to completely give up trying to be popular. Mm-hmm. Okay. Once you do that, then you can be yourself. I think what actually is very disappointing to people is when they find, when you lose your energy, when you find that what you have to say is not popular and people don't like you. And then that's depressing. But I've never expected to be popular. My grandfather taught me not to be. Says it's just, why would you want to be popular? It's a yoke you're taking on. That's why I don't care what the critics say, you know? So, but I actually find exhilarating this small elite group that understands. Like, it's just such an elite group. They're so damn smart. And our conversation is so damn smart. And everybody's on top of it. And whenever there's a new idea about what to do about something, or actually a critique about something that we propose that is not going to work, and you see how the critique is received, thank you for the critique. That's really interesting. Thank you. I'll try to work with it. It's like living on oxygen, on pure oxygen. It's like it's being surrounded by people who in fact are not fools and are not trying to fool themselves. So the great reward are my friends. By the way, there is a movement of this called already, which you might want to interview. It's called the Transition Town movement. Transition Town. It started in England. And it is also called, it began in a town called Totnes, Totness in England. And they're sometimes called Totnes towns. And these are people who understand that we're not going to make it with climate change. They already have 600 towns and cities signed up. But the key book, and I'm talking about a book that's at the level of Chris Alexander's Pattern Language, is a book that's called Lean Logic. Okay, Lean Logic, and it is by David Fleming, who died a few years ago. It's the most amazing book. If I had to go to the moon for if I had to go to jail for 3 years with one book, I would take that and Chris Alexander. It's fantastic. And it lays it all out with very good humor.
Really?
And what I'm trying to answer is, first of all, it's the best writing you've ever seen. But here's what I'm trying to answer. Do you know why I'm optimistic? Because when things break down, as they will, and it's all locked in now, right? The capitalist system is locked in, and the way the government works is locked in, and everything's locked in. Okay. If we have a shock that's large enough, it will unlock, and there'll be the opportunity to design fabulous places, better than ever have been designed. Right now, we're not allowed to do it, okay? Because the sheer resistance to change, and we're always compromising, always knowing that what we're doing isn't good enough, etc. But it's a fantastic experience to imagine that as things really break down, that it's going to be possible to say, look, now let's try this pilot project, get off our back. Let's do it right, and that's why we're optimistic and excited. It's actually based on the breakdown of systems, because you can't fight the systems. They lock up.
Right.
They're so mutually supportive.
Yeah.
They're locked in with each other. They support each other, and you can't work within it anymore. The clever bastards is all locked in. But when it falls apart, there'll be a chance. And that's the source of the optimism.
That's I think it takes a unique type of person to view the situation in that way. I think for most people, they just be scared shitless of it. And it certainly feels like with all of the things that are happening, that maybe that moment it's all going to come to head maybe sooner than later. By 10, 20 years.
Remember, it's not physical. What's going to happen is not physical. There'll be warm days, there'll be storms, there'll be hurricanes, there'll be fires. We already have them. We already have all that happening as intensely as will ever happen. It's not getting more intense. It's just going to happen. It's not going to happen more often. We've already been through it. What's going to happen is mental, not physical. Okay? When the day comes that we realize that we have reached at most, not every, but most irreversible tipping points, and that we've lost nature. And it's now self-fulfilling. And you're going to say, what do I do now? That will be the point. Okay, so remember, the reason it's sooner rather than later is that I think the news are getting worse and worse. The real lesson of the Ukraine war for most people should be, you notice how they've won the economic, right? They've won the economic war already. You can read about it in the paper. There may be maybe not the military one, but the economic one. Okay. And I think what happened in Ukraine is it revealed the Germans buying gas and oil from the Russians. It revealed that the Chinese are buying Russian oil, and it's now revealed they're not good guys. They're actually buying the oil. India. Why is India on Russia's side? Why? Do you know why? If you don't have gas, what are you going to cook with? Like, what are you going to cook with in India? Mm-hmm. Tell me. Little twigs? Mm-hmm. Are you going to burn your clothing? You can't cook for 3 days without natural gas from Russia. I mean, please. Mm-hmm. And do you think that Iran, with all of its oil, do you think that Russia, with all of its oil, do you think Brazil? Why is Brazil on the side of Russia? Because of energy. They were just faking it. They were faking that they were going to meet the standards of 2030 and 2050. They can't. Their whole economy is based on selling oil to other people. They were lying. Why can't people see that? It's all been revealed. The curtain has been pulled. Everybody was lying. And what about Mr. Biden? Saying we're shutting down the pipelines and drilling, but trying to induce Saudi Arabia to produce more oil that we can buy. And even Venezuela, getting Venezuela, for all God's sake, to make more oil. I mean, why don't people see the how fake it all was? That it's all virtue signaling, because that's the lesson.
I think it's difficult for a lot of people, frankly, to pay attention to these things, because for the average middle class, lower class folks, they have more immediate things to be concerned about.
Oh, they do.
It's very I was going to say self-centered. That sounds derogatory.
No.
But it's the facts.
Life is tough. They have to survive. Things are difficult. It's difficult to get through the day when you're poor. It's amazing. When you have a flat tire, for you and me, the flat tires, how inconvenient. For them, it's a tragedy.
Yeah.
They got a flat tire. They can't get to work, and they can't afford a new tire. I mean, what the? Or a tow truck. You have to sort of hang around with poor people. Everything is triple the difficulty.
Yeah.
And yes, of course, but that, on the other hand, somebody has to take the leadership position because they don't have time. And that's something that is considered very arrogant. Like, who are you to come up with these ideas? First of all, I don't come up with any of these ideas. If you blame somebody, blame David Fleming, who's a genius. Okay, he knows. Okay, I'm just his pencil.
Right.
Okay, I'm his pencil.
Well,
they're always killing the messenger.
Let me ask you something. So, this question might lead to a conversation about traditional or classical planning and architecture as being viewed as a thing of the past and more past looking, as opposed to modernism, which is about the future and future looking. It might get to, I don't know, many other things. So the Pattern Language book, written by Christopher Alexander, is something I've read. I read it all the way through. Read it twice, actually. Phenomenal book. We actually wanted to have him on the show, but sadly he passed and was ill. Anyway, I was talking with the head or chair of a department at a pretty well-known architecture school not long ago about urban design being taught in the school. And their remark during this conversation, which is just between the two of us, was that, lessons by Christopher Alexander or Kevin Lynch and these types of people, it's so outdated. It's not relevant anymore. We've moved way beyond this, because think about the technological shifts that have happened in all ways, from transportation to mobile technologies to communication to all of these things. These books and these lessons, they're just, why are we still talking about them, was actually the thing they said. Why are we still talking about them?
Well, because they're going to come back when all the complex tech falls apart. Well, that's the short answer. But you know what happens? It's all, what they're allergic to is nostalgia. They think that Alexander is nostalgic for the past, while they themselves are nostalgic for the future. Okay? Because what they're talking about hasn't happened yet. Okay? The modernists, they're all, it's performance art about a future that hasn't happened yet. Modernism has always been that way. They're both nostalgic for the past and the future. I'm pragmatist, and I'm trying to get as many people as possible in my circle to be pragmatists, which is to say you take for both, whatever works best in the long run. I am designing without heedlessly and without polemic, both modernist, I take from modernism and traditionalism without even knowing the difference. Okay, I don't even polemize. It's not even complicated in my head. You know, if a column needs to be X diameter, you get a lolly column. Okay, if you need to whatever, then it's the other thing. It's made out of stone. Yeah, you might as well proportion it with antithesis. You know, what the hell? It actually works better. You know, like I have no, you know, but it took me. It honestly took me probably from 10 to 15 years to overcome my architectural education. It took longer to overcome it than to get it.
What do you mean by overcome it? What had to be overcome?
Well, because you're taught ideologically by, for example, this very compelling professor you spoke to, who says it's all the past, it's all about communication. And then you realize that actually it affects you. The communication actually, it affects you, and it can be very good, and we incorporate it insofar as it does, but it does not replace going out and meeting somebody on the street. You know, it just doesn't. And why not both? All of our renderings in the old days had towers, you know, in the town center to receive people, we thought, oh my God, this is so great. We're going to now really get people to come to the park because that's where Wi-Fi is going to be available. The worst thing that ever happened to urbanism is that Wi-Fi is now distributed to the house. Like I remember when I first came to this French town, the Wi-Fi was only in the square. God, that was great. We were all there with Wi-Fi. And anyway, so yes, of course we love Wi-Fi. I'm a total tech guy in that regard. And but it's all together. It's by the way, speaking of really good books, this was all put out by David Brooks in the book, this ideology of pragmatism, in the book called Bobos in Paradise, which is about 15 or 20 years old. And I would put that on the list, Bobos in Paradise, B-O-B-O, which is bourgeois bohemians, okay? And the bourgeois bohemians are the people who select the contradiction. And it is a very serious book, and it explains a lot of our attitude. So that's a good one. The other good one is David Fleming. By the way, if you read Alexander 3 times, read Fleming. Just get it. It's a beautiful book. It's $50. It's a gorgeous book. And so well written. Oh my God, it's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure. Yeah.
It's funny when you're describing your approach and you're describing looking at the modernists, looking at the classicists, looking at the different towns, the Mormons, and all these different things, and you just take what makes sense from both and all sides and you assemble it. Yeah. That's the most straightforward, obvious, common sense way to go about doing anything, it would seem. And certainly when you're designing something that is going to impact a lot of people, is it ever... I mean, I wonder, like, is it ever frustrating that you'd have to go through all this effort to explain ideas to people on both sides of the spectrum, and both sides on either spectrum are somehow getting annoyed with you while you're trying to go about these endeavors? When for you, it's like, I'm just trying to make the best of the situation.
No, what happens to me is they immediately assume that I have always been, or that I'm invincibly provincial. Okay, that's the assumption. So the first thing that I do is in a public debate, I really know a lot. Okay, I've studied all my life. I'm 73 years old. And I know Le Corbusier backwards and forwards. Okay, and I know the British new towns more than anybody that I've ever met. And I know the garden cities. I read constantly and I retain. Okay. The fact is that I can actually win any debate on the basis of knowledge. Like, you want to debate Le Corbusier? I know where the flea laid the egg in Pessac. Okay. I know. Okay. And I know the different phases of Pessac, and I know who he talked to, and I know who his client was. I know all this shit. And I find it very enjoyable to know it. What they do is they avoid debating. The debate occurs always in my absence. Okay. And then what happens, it always occurs in my absence. And then I have to marshal a huge effort to correct things. It's not an interesting debate because all I'm doing is factually correcting what they're saying. It's not a debate in which we're trying to, there's a pursuit of some truth. There's a pursuit of some agreement, something that makes sense for both of us. No, it's not about that. In our case, it's about taking us down, the academy, and all I do, which is boring as shit, is to actually just correct them factually.
Right.
It's just a factual correct. It's not a fact. And I say, well, Seaside is this way. I say, have you ever been there? Because if you have, you know, it's exactly the opposite of what you're saying. Exactly the opposite. You read that, didn't you? I can always tell you read that. You read it, and and none of them have ever been to Seaside or Alice Beach or anything that they've ever been. Now, if you want to know what's wrong with each of them, you want to have a critique, you run a critique. Do you want to run a critique on celebration? I'll show you how to do that. I'll show you exactly how a critique of urbanism is done. And I actually wrote a paper once on celebration, which was just to show the academics how you critique urbanism. You're welcome to see it. It's how you critique it. And the first thing you do is you do not compare a place that's 10 years old with Manhattan, who's 300 years old, okay? You compare apples to apples. And by the way, Seaside was much more sophisticated than Manhattan on year 10. Okay, if you take Seaside year 10 and Manhattan year 10, you know, at least you could drink the water in Seaside, you know?
Well, sure.
You see, you were living in mud with pigs in your house in year 10. So the first thing you do
slightly
is you
different era.
Well, you compare urbanism at the age that it has. You know, yes. So it's 70 years old. What was Charleston at year 70? What's our place at year 70? That's number one. Number two is you always have to take into account the distance from the metropolis. Okay, you can't just say, well, over there, that town in Oklahoma, it's a bunch of people who just whatever didn't go to good colleges. Well, I'm sorry, you know, whatever your critique is, it has always happened historically. So always you compare with distance from the metropolis. Okay, and if the metropolis is now not Oklahoma City, which it should be, but it's no longer, it's like Boston and New York, Washington, well, you compare with other towns that are the same distance from the metropolis. That's number two. Okay, so number one is the age of the town, number two. And number three, which is, I think, very important, is what are the demographics of the place? Because, for example, there are places where there are no black people. There are counties where there are no black people. So what am I supposed to do? Put them in a bus and import them? I mean, if the overall region doesn't have black people because they're all smarter than to live there because they're all trying to get jobs in Seattle, right? And they've all skipped out, you know, or it's been a very white county. If you want me to actually have particularly racial integration in exactly the proportion you prefer, then elect me Stalin. Okay, Stalin could actually move populations. You say, you get in this train and move there. Okay, but if no one has that power, why are you holding new urbanists? And then the other thing is, well, you're gentrifying.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
Gentrifying. Well, what about where you live right now? Like, why is it? Where are the new urbanists blamed for gentrification and not Boston and New York? Like, what is going on? So what's happening is the debate is actually idiotic. It's like two cavemen clubbing each other. There's nothing sophisticated about a debate between a new urbanist and an academic. They're just factual corrections, you know, from our side, and actually just complete misquoting of prior misunderstandings and factual irrelevancies on the other side. That doesn't work. What you want is, for example, I will debate a modernist on modernism and do pretty well. I will debate Rem Koolhaas on what Rem Koolhaas has written because I know exactly what he's doing. Okay, but I ask you, if you want to have a new urbanist debate, come to a Congress for the New Urbanism. We're violent with each other, but we know what we're talking about. Like, you know, 1,300 people show up to just sort of take each other down, but out of sheer pursuit, first of all, out of sheer knowledge of what it was really about, but also pursuing a common interest as opposed to just taking the other person down.
Right.
So no, it's not frustrating. It's just boring.
Yeah.
And finally, I have ceased to do it. I do not accept debates with people who don't know anything. I will debate somebody standing in the place. I'll debate somebody standing in Seaside and say, well, tell me, you say, you think Seaside is too neat? Show me where. Show me. Place is a mess. It's a mess. You know, what are you talking about? You'd like that. You know, where I'm standing in the evidence. It's not even photographic. Because urbanism, by the way, you can't debate from photographs. You can't.
Yeah.
You have to stand there and live the day from 7 o'clock in the morning to midnight. Live the day and then tell me how we're doing. Because that's really what we design. Is how do you live your day? Not what it looks like. That's so stupid.
Although,
and by the way, I want to tell you something. For me, style is camouflage. Okay? If I'm going to have a radical program of diversity, of socioeconomic diversity and mixed use diversity, you know, and I do it in a traditional way so that the buildings are harmonious, that's camouflage. That's all style is camouflage. By the way, all these buildings that are hot seat hot condominiums in New York that are so radical, they're all for rich people.
Sure.
The style is just camouflage. You're signaling that you would rather if the revolution, the socialist revolution would already have happened, but it hasn't. So we're just camouflaging it. We're camouflaging the homogeneity. Virtually every modernist building is homogeneous programmatically. Even the affordable housing. And yet they have all this diversity going on. And so if you can do that, if you can camouflage your essential conservatism by having a radical style, I would like to camouflage our radical proposition with a conservative style. It's just camouflage.
Right.
Boy, do they hate hearing this.
But that's the truth, though, and that's one of the things that I think is more interesting about Seaside. First of all, there is a lot of architecture there that, despite me practicing more the modern style or aesthetic or whatever, I adore a lot of the architecture of Seaside. It's incredible. But that completely
it's
aside,
got a lot of modernism too.
The lessons learned from there have more to do with the planning, the program, and all the stuff you're describing. I mean, that's the key takeaway, more so than any one photograph, for sure.
But, you know, for example, like if you look at you take one of the Charleston side houses to the north, okay? Some of them have 4 apartments in them. 4 apartments. You know, if I express the 4 apartments, look how radical I am. I got 4 apartments here next to your expensive house.
Right.
You wouldn't get it through.
Right.
So what we do is just dress the damn thing into a nice, sober Charleston side yard house. And everybody's fine. Do you know what the density of Charleston is? You know, the so-called the very conservative houses. It's 27 units to the acre.
Ooh.
It's radically dense by American standards.
Yeah.
But it's all hidden in nice porches. You have to count the doorbells to realize that density of Charleston, historic Charleston.
I had one specific question, which was, could a new urbanism and a town like Seaside work just as well if the architectural, let's call it style, or the camouflage was more in the, and speaking more from the general public sensibility, more in the modern aesthetic, right? Clean lines and I don't know, whatever you would say.
Absolutely. We did one. We've done modernist towns. There's Aqua in Miami Beach, but then the context is modernist. So there was no cultural problem. But over in Colorado, we did a town called Prospect, which is modernist. It's a standard issue, townhouses and houses and mixed use, and it's modernist. And it's because there was, in that particular place in Colorado, a market for modernism. But it's not, if there isn't a market for it, look, we're an urban reform movement, okay? The new urbanists are we're not an architectural reform movement, and I think the modernists don't like us because we're not carrying their water.
Right.
They say, well, why aren't you doing modernist stuff so that we can become popular? Why are you allowing us? Because you do that. That's your problem. You reform architecture. I'm doing urbanism.
Right.
It's an urban reform movement. And actually, the associations of your modernist buildings, including the fact that they actually do leak and they're actually slightly uncomfortable and you don't care about closets. Okay, I'm not carrying that water for you. I'm not carrying that water. That's your problem. Okay? So leave me alone to do the urbanism. And when the time comes, I can do modernism beautifully. I totally enjoy it. And I don't mean about the style, okay? I do modernist plan strategies, And when there's a market for it, yes, of course we do it. It's cool. But when there's not a market for it, that's not my reform agenda. That's not my stone of Sisyphus. That's yours.
One question, just a couple last ones because we're nearing the end here, is, you describe some of the design thinking and strategies behind Seaside as a case study, but how did that come about in terms of the people, the funding, the real estate, those kinds of things?
That's a very long story. That's a very long story. And I'm just going to give you hints of the ingredients. I'm not going to make the souffle. Okay, I'm just going to give you the ingredients. First of all, Robert Davis, a developer, had a nostalgia for his childhood beach town. Okay, and so after doing 3 modernist projects in Miami, which he did very good modernist projects. It was practice for Seaside, which is the big piece of land that he had inherited. He wanted it to be very much what he remembered. And he wanted to bring families together, over the summer, because the families, including his, were fragmented. And so it took him a while to convince us. We right away, Liz and I, we glommed on. We understood that traditional urbanism was gonna do it. That's the thing. But it took him quite an effort to get us to understand traditionalism, and which we didn't know at the beginning. We had to learn it. Okay? We had to learn it because he forced us to. But the urbanism was something that Liz and I, because I grew up in Barcelona and she grew up in Philadelphia, we knew small town, suburban Philadelphia. We knew urbanism. We knew what it was like. We knew what it was like to be a child in a place like that. So that was, and we were ready to do it. So there was serendipity. The second thing that happened is that he was experienced, but it was the recession, so he went slowly. So it gave us time to learn. And I have never had so much time to learn and think as that first project of ours. So that was very important, because now we have to move at a tremendous pace. Like, once the developers bought a piece of land, their interest is being paid, and you have to move fast. You got to know what you're doing. There's no time to explore. So that was the first thing about Seaside, is there was time, because we were in a recession. The third thing, which was interesting, is that it was such a primitive location in Florida that there were no bureaucrats to tell us no. No, you can't do a street that width. You can't do this. You can't do that. There were no bureaucrats. It was too rural, too rustic. And in those days, all over rustic America, there were virtually no codes. They would say, tell us when you start construction, let us know when you're done, so we can put you in the tax rolls. And by the way, talk to the utilities so you hook up properly. That was it. Let us notify us when you start. meet the code, whatever code it is, because otherwise you're not going to get a mortgage. So meet the code. We're not going to check. And then let us know when you're done and put you in the tax rolls, and make sure the utilities connect. That was it.
That's crazy.
So if we had run across opposition, as such as exists now, we were defenseless. We didn't know the arguments. We would have not been able to do it. So it was incredible. A lot of things coincided for it to occur.
Amazing.
And then the personalities involved were polemicists. Like Robert Davis is a great and very well educated. The developers are very well educated. He's a developer, but he's old style, more like a Renaissance prince, than a spreadsheet guy. And then, of course, we were combative. We were out of the development of 1968. We were the generation of 68. Like we needed to have something to fight about, to get excited, to fight about something. And wow, what a fight! This is great. We're gonna have a movement. The whole idea of here's another thing that's important. When we grew up, the star architects were young. And they had taken every position. Okay, there was no position open. Okay, they all had taken positions. And so when we grew up, we said, "Oh, there's only one position left, which is the movement." They forgot the movement. It was all the individuals. Okay, so they wanted to be like Frank Lloyd Wright. They wanted to be like Le Corbusier. They wanted to be like Terragni. They all wanted to be individual stars. When we wanted to be CIAM, we wanted to be the movement. And that position was not taken, my God. And we took it, and we took it consciously. And so we actually created a movement, which is incredibly more resilient and a hell of a lot more fun than being a star architect.
That's amazing.
One last question. Do you have any favorite town or place that, is maybe the one that you think the most whenever you're designing a new city, or something that's just always in the back of your mind?
Not one of ours. Like, you're not saying,
not one of yours.
Visit one of your towns, which would it be? No, you're saying what I have in mind. No, I have a I wrote a book called, I wrote two books. I think they're both, you should get them. Okay. One of them is called The Lexicon of the New Urbanism, in which I basically stabilized the vocabulary so we could talk to each other. Okay. An avenue means something, a boulevard means something, a street means something, a road means something, it all means something. And I did it in such a way, it's interesting because I basically did it as a translation to modern developer parlance. Huh. So it's a translation. But also what I thought was that a discipline needed a common language, okay, so we could talk to each other. And also so there could be a certain mystique, the way the doctors make up things, incredible sounding names, sure. So you trust them. Or even landscape architects with their Latin names. So, so we developed a mystique. Now, to do that, I had to read every book on planning to find out, which, by the way, is not hard 20 years ago, because they were not that, it's a young profession. As a profession, urban planning is from horsemen. It's not before that. Before it was amateurs, sheep herders and people like that, Roman soldiers, right? So, or religious freaks like Brigham Young. They weren't professionals. Right. So the literature is not that deep. Like the first history that I know was written in 1909. First history of urbanism was the first 3 chapters of Raymond Unwin's book. It's not that old. Right. So I looked through everything. I Xeroxed everything. And then when I was done, I had a pile of 700 Xeroxes that were the coolest things I know. So then I did a book called The New Civic Art, in which I published them with captions. And that was the captions. That's basically a Xerox of all the cool stuff I knew I'd ever found. And so I have a very, very large repertoire. For example, in terms of regional patterns, I discovered that there were 6 regional patterns, which is more than one, but also not an infinite number. They're essentially 6. And things like that. Okay, types of grids. Well, there are 7 types of grids, which is more than 2, but not an infinite number. So I realized that it was richer than anybody thought, but also limited. So when I dream of a town, okay, it definitely has to do with one of these that I know that is historic. Okay, but it depends on what I'm thinking, what's relevant. I don't say, I've got this idea and I will impose it on the next bastard that comes around for a design. The way Steve Hall does sketches and says, well, I was so inspired by a Swiss cheese or something, like whoever comes in next gets the Swiss cheese of the building. I don't do that. But I do stumble around and find where the DNA is, that will actually grow real fast if I water it. And of course, the skill set is selecting the DNA, like being really good at finding something that'll work easily. And it's not about hybriding or concoctions or witch's brews. It's right. Like, this is what it's like on an island with bad workmanship and with, let us say, a pretty dicey infrastructure. Like, what do I know that is on an island with bad workmanship and dicey infrastructure and hurricanes? And I choose pretty well. It's not like, I saw this town on Lake Michigan, that kind of shit. No, that's right. Not what we do. Okay. And, but I do have the advantage, and this is a pretty unique advantage. I know very few people Creer is one of them. Creer is like me. I'm like him. We also have the full modernist repertoire, the full repertoire. I know it all. And sometimes that's what you have to use. It's really the way to go. There's a lot of Le Corbusier, which is brilliant. You don't have to do the parts that don't work,
Sure.
But it doesn't mean that you don't know it. So we have the traditional and modern repertoire, and we don't always fall back on diagonal avenues from Paris when it's irrelevant. Like, for example, when I know the developer is going to lose control, and we're going to be marginalized in terms of the buildings that get built, because we very seldom design buildings. We ask dozens of other architects to design buildings, and we know when we get marginalized, when we know the developer is going to get marginalized, we actually design a very forgiving plan, And then when we know that a developer is a detail maniac that's going to sweat it out every day, we say we're going to up the ante here and do something that's more demanding. It's like you don't send the reserve to take Guadalcanal. You send the Marine Corps. So when we have a developer that's a kind of Marine Corps, like a real hard ass person committed to excellence, we give them the mission of excellence. Like if you visit Alice Beach, quite near Seaside, you'll never see better architecture. I mean, you've got to come down and see Seaside, Rosemary Beach, and Alice. There are three right next to each other, and they're 10 years apart, and they're all incredibly different. Like anybody who says the new urbanism is all the same has not opened a book of photographs. They just read that somewhere.
Right. Let alone visit the place.
Oh, yeah. No. They're very smart not to visit. Very smart. It's the only way they can actually sustain their position is by not visiting.
Andres, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We typically cover like the life story of a person, and we'd even get to that because we had a good time chatting about all the various aspects anyway. This was great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.